customize it a little bit to Twitter. I think that's kind of working. It's still something that is a work in progress, but we are certainly looking into that issue. So another thing we're modeling, not this slide, but another thing we're modeling is something called basic human values. Those are basically, they describe what motivates you. And so we're using exactly the same approach for values as we're using for personality. Again, we have a bunch of ground truth. A bunch of people took value surveys for us. We have their social media, so again, we come up with correlation factors. We're also working on something called what we call fundamental needs. And this, I mean, it does go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and other things, but it's also heavily related to some work by Ford in the marketing domain, where basically, and I realize probably some of the words in this diagram are a little bit hard to see, but basically they identified a bunch of different dimensions along which people have affinities to different products. So one example, which are kind of opposite properties. So in one case there's practicality is a dimension, somewhere in there.
Go over that.
You okay? Oh yeah, right there. It's big, that's why I didn't see it. So practicality is one dimension, and somewhat on the opposite side of that is I don't know what it's called here, but essentially is the preference for like luxury items, for example. So if you're highly practical, then we know that you're likely to purchase things that get the job done, and that's kind of it. Whereas if you're low in practicality, maybe more over on the other side, you tend to prefer things that are a little bit more luxurious, for example. And that's just an example. There are a bunch of dimensions. You can go quite deep into this. And so what we've done in this case is instead of using the Luke dictionary, which is not well designed for looking at product descriptions, what we've instead been doing is developing our own language, or our own dictionary, I should say, where again we apply exactly the same approach that we applied before with word counting and whatnot, but the words and the dictionary that we use to apply to them actually has been custom built. A lot of that happened actually through Mechanical Turk. So we had a bunch of people fill out surveys, tell us a little bit about themselves, and then we went from that and their social media content and a bunch of other things. It was quite an involved process to develop this dictionary, and so that's how we're deriving means. I think I was going to show a demo, but I didn't figure out how to get on the network here. I can do that afterwards.
Oh, you can.
Someone can. Yeah, I'm sure we can. Let's just not do it right now. I'm happy to do it again. Yeah.
There's a Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Can you? It looks like you could apply this technique with a different library, I assume, to other problems like political elections or whatever. That we could use that kind of approach. Just, I mean, obviously it's not the same. You'd have to sort of recalibrate it for voting rather than buying, I guess.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think one of the open questions is when do we need a new dictionary versus when can we just like use Luke, for example. Honestly, with voting, I have no idea. I almost feel like Luke could work for that. Just because I suspect maybe Republicans and Democrats use slightly different words and maybe it would just come through. But maybe we would need a custom dictionary, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, just to comment on that, there have been studies that show that people on the left and right have very different psychological profiles or psycholinguistic profiles. So, and in terms of individualization, I think the Obama campaign did a lot of it. Maybe not what you guys are talking about here. So I think it's just a matter of time.
Yep.
And I had another question, which is, just in my mind.
There's someone in the back. Right, and that's an interesting question. So we are beginning some work with a professor at Tufts. His name is escaping me right now. I think it's Justin Hollander, maybe. I mean, he's in urban planning, and so we are beginning to look at that, but we haven't done too much of it yet. We did also have a big project a while ago, which again I could talk about later if anyone's interested, but that was on trying to predict where a person, what location a person lives in based on their tweets. Completely different, but that also would definitely apply to this kind of thing, especially when you don't have geotags.
What was her question? It's not entirely obvious to me what she asked you.
Oh, what was her question?
Yes.
Her question, I think, was in different locations, do you see different traits or things like that? Was that essentially your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Is there? Yeah.
So I can see how you can build a profile of an individual over a period of time by his tweets. To claim just-in-time customer intelligence, I don't see how you beat the current real-time bidding systems that are really using the data stored on the user's computer in cookies and doing very quick analysis of what a customer just looked at a different website, and they're able to place ads within a matter of seconds, right? As opposed to the loop in here is much longer, so I don't know how you claim just in time.
Well, I think that's a good question. Just in time might be not the best choice of words here, at least for this audience. However, I think partly what we're talking about here is, now you're right that calculating these profiles requires some amount of time back in the future, or some amount of data going back in time. However, the profiles themselves can be, continually updated in real time, and we can just keep them going. And I think the one thing I would argue to your point is that if you have this information coupled with the things that you already mentioned, that I think will allow people to make better offers in real time. But you're right that calculating these things in real time stuff.
I could probably add to that.
Yeah.
I'm involved in a company which does real-time bidding and all that. So there's real-time data in terms of what is of interest to you, which is also informed by your past history. So it's not that you have to have, you clicked on certain products and that will inform your ad decision, but you look at the past history and see if you have 10 choices of products to make advertisement for, what does your past tell you of the choice I should make in terms of which 3 I should pick? So it's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
How much data do you need to analyze to make your insights more reliable?
That's a great question. So what we found, and we've done a bunch of these analyses, we found that we need about 200 tweets, and those are 200, of your own tweets. That doesn't count retweets, right? So if you look at a count of someone's tweets, that does include retweets. So we need 200 original tweets to get very reliable, and 400 to really, feel very confident.
And you measure reliable by having a test set where you actually give them.
Yeah, right. I wish I had some of these graphs in my slide deck. I don't. But you see this kind of,
So you actually get a bunch of people who take these personality tests.
Oh yeah.
And then you
Yes.
compare them.
Yeah. I mean, for all this work, it's very important that we have ground truth data. So we have a data set of, I forget, it's a few hundred people who have taken personality tests, have also done the values survey. Those are both, standard surveys that, some psychologists developed.
And
Yeah.
when you say good, what is the error rate, or how do you measure it?
I wish I knew that number off the top of my head. I don't. It was work that someone else did, so unfortunately, I just don't know. Yeah.
How do you deal with the fact that extroverts inherently tweet more? Extroverts are much more verbal. They're more open. I mean, but we certainly do not, have. You can't model that and say we're going to consume a certain way. I mean, how can you? You're not going to get the introverts with this model.
Well, I don't think I agree that introverts don't tweet, which is, I think, what you're saying. It may be true that they tweet at a lower rate, maybe. But I'm not even. Honestly, we should do the analysis and see if that's even true, because I don't think it is actually. Because, well, at least my understanding of extroversion has much more to do with social interactions. Twitter isn't necessarily about social interaction. I mean, you could just be putting something out there. You don't ever have to actually see anyone. So it's not clear to me that introversion is actually going to. In fact, if you look at my profile, which is very accurate, my introversion is very low, but I also tweet a lot. So, I don't know. I'm just not sure that you're right.
So you said you need 200 to 400 tweets. That means
Right.
I should tweet like once a day. Right? In the 3 years I have twatted twice.
Extensive tweeting.
Like, how many people tweet every day?
So it works on
I like to know by show of hands. There's Lauren over there tweeting every day.
I don't use tweet too. I use Facebook every day. Not Twitter, not Twitter.
But he said he's not using Facebook.
Huh?
He's not using Facebook.
Facebook is better. I don't tweet. I don't tweet. But I Facebook every day. And it's 5 times a day.
Anyway, can I ask you the point? The point is this tool is used on people who tweet, and so they present the solutions.
So are you kind of in that situation where we had this election where they used DMV records when very few people had cars and they predicted an entirely different outcome for a presidential election?
No,
It was like in the early 1900s, right?
I mean, we're not trying to do those kinds of predictions, so I think we're having that problem.
You're
but-
probably accurate on the individual who
Right.
is tweeting.
Yeah.
And I think it might be fair to say that you just need that much text from the individual. And
Right.
whatever
Exactly right.
comes.
I mean, if we can get text from other places, great. Twitter is very convenient though for games.
So do you use any sort of other approach, like a numerical approach? You know, use data instead of you are using right now. You are now linguistic approach. So that was text-based analysis, right?
Right.
Do you adopt any sort of numerical try together? So people's data instead of text regarding their.
So we, in my particular research group, do not. Clearly, there are people within IBM who are doing that kind of work.
But the detailed data that you're getting, how much will that swing? Because that's like some numbers. I don't know what type of data it is that you're getting for retail.
Right.
Other than tweets. So how does that data important for you?
Well, I mean, so the data, again, remember, so for retail, we've got a customer database which has a little bit of information about, who that person is, name and address and so a few other things.
Does that have their any
And then there's also some purchase history associated with that. And then we have social media accounts. So we got to match them up, and then for the ones where we get good matches, then we look at the purchase history to try to infer essentially some personality mappings across different types of product purchases. Yeah.
What kind of legal repercussions do you see in this?
That's a very good question. I think it's a very open question, actually.
How do you make a person subject to your system?
Well, I think it's like a lot of other data mining that's going on this form, right? I mean, it's not like we have explicit authorization from users to do this, but we do have the appropriate licenses from Twitter, GNIP in this case, to make use of that data. Definitely, and I think this is a big open question that we could probably discuss all night, right? But how does the normal person on the street think this data is being used versus how's it actually being used? And I do think, what we're talking about here is even a level beyond probably what most people think can be done with their data, right? I mean, they think I'm putting a tweet out there, and maybe I'm revealing that I like Justin Bieber, let's say, which would be very embarrassing for me to do that anyway. But in fact, they're actually also revealing, their intrinsic traits and things like that. And that's, I'm sure a lot of people don't expect that. On the other hand, if you know that this is possible, there are ways to counter it, because if you know what the dictionary is, you can throw all sorts of extra words in there and mess things up. So. Right. But we can sell this technology to them.
I have one more question for you.
Sure.
So when it comes to marketing, the way you are classifying personality is across the board. The other approach is to use graph databases to see who's connected to whom. And your premise there is, I will buy something that my friends are also buying, or my people in my group network are buying.
Right.
So what do you think is more effective? The graph database type of approach or this approach? for marketing?
I don't think either of them probably are superior to the other. I think they're definitely different. Let me think. I'm not sure if there's anything more that I can say about that. Just because we haven't.
I would say they're complementary. They could be
Right.
complementary.
Exactly.
I mean, I could
Exactly.
say this is the extrovert in the network and kind of target them for
Right.
extra promotion so they would do this. I mean,
Sure. Sure.
I
Yeah.
think there are things.
So, on a minor point, in terms of mapping the words in the dictionary to personality profiles,
Yes.
are you using an internal tool, an open source, the Austin work, or?
Well, it varies. So for the need stuff, it's all things that we've developed internally. For personality, we're using the dictionary developed by the Loop people with our own internal processing. But I mean, the processing is very simple. I mean, I described it to you, shift accounting. The other internal stuff we're doing is like trying to extend the dictionary, which I also mentioned. So obviously that's internal too. But yeah, you can go to, I think it's loop.net, liwc.net, and for, I don't know, if it's $100 or something, get the software and Microsoft.
So what is the boundary between historical data and real-time data, or near-time data? What is the boundary, like 3 days ago, 1 day ago, 3 hours ago? You know? What is the boundary? Definitely you analyze both historical data and near-time data, right?
Right. So I mean, almost all of our profile processing is at least right now, it's non-real time. I mean, you could imagine, again, like I said, updating the profiles in real time, but we don't do that yet. They're actually, I mean, and so if you get into a little bit, and I'll talk about engagement here in a second, which I think is probably the next slide. Yeah. So in the engagement scenarios that I'm about to talk about, a lot of what happens is, we're watching in real time for, a certain type of person. They say, some particular thing, and then at that point, if we decide that they're a good enough candidate to engage with, then we're going to go back, we're going to collect all their tweets, we're going to do a personality profile, we're going to, decide are they really a good candidate to engage with, and how are we going to engage with them, and then we would reach back out. So in that case, you've got this real-time component of kind of doing the initial identification of a potential person to reach out to, I should say, and then some offline analysis to verify that and to understand them better, followed up with the engagement. So
actually,
I don't know if that.
A good use case is, an individual just tweets at Twitter, right? And in the meantime, he also is shopping online at Amazon.com. So
Sure.
after he tweets, he just pressed
Right.
the button
Right.
and made a purchase,
Yep.
So that's a very good use case in terms of engagement.
Right. And theoretically, we
And
should
you
be
also
able to reach out.
you have his historical data about his, purchase record or tweet history, whatever. So you can analyze what he's gonna do next.
Yep. Yeah. No, there's a bunch of things to do there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the engagement stuff now. So this is kind of changing directions a little bit, and also I should preface this by. Oh yeah, sorry.
Before you go to another
Yeah, no
section,
problem.
I just want to ask one question. So
Sure.
you just mentioned you can actually leverage the data you get from the tweets and social networks with actual retail data.
Yeah, well, that's what we're doing now with a couple of customers.
I want to how do one get without using third party, let's say APIs or third party services to actually go from the Twitter handle, the email, to the actual purchase data. So let's say to the actual retail data that huge retail chains have. So I mean, can you share some more information about this?
Well, I mean, we're working directly with those customers, right? So they're just giving us our data. There doesn't need to be an API involved. In terms of the matching, again, so the only third-party API involved in what we're doing right now is the GNIP API to go get Twitter data. So, and so the way that's working right now, although I think this needs to change at some point, but what we're doing right now is we have the 10% feed from GNIP of Twitter, which we're just constantly keeping and saving. And so that's our data source from which to do the matching. So we get, again, from the customer, this address data and whatnot, and we have this big Hadoop-based and rule-based matching system that goes and figures out, who does this customer have a Twitter account, and if so, which one is it? And then we already have the purchase data again from the customer, so there's not an API involved with that.
So basically, like email and the Twitter handle is provided by the actual customer.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's what we're doing. Yeah.
When you say customer, do you mean the big enterprises that have the data, or actual purchase history from the individual customers?
I mean customers by the end. So they are generally, we're looking across a few industries: retail, finance was mentioned in the video, travel and transportation.
Corporations, right? The customer.
Yes, they're corporations.
And how do you tie that individual person? I mean, that's always a good question. You have this social information that an individual like me, for
Right.
example, puts out there, and then you have this aggregate information that these customers have. Maybe they have specific information on people, but how do you tie the two together to know that somebody like me who says specific things actually has a specific transaction history like that? How do you tie those two together?
Well, so again, I mean, from, let's say it's a retailer, just to make this simple, right? So the retailer gives us, information for a customer, demographics, identifying information, and the transaction stuff. And then we have a rule-based system which processes a bunch of tweets. Essentially, it has a bunch of rules that are involved in this process for attempting to do the match from the tweets to the customer data. And there are a bunch of rules. I mean, one of the most naive rules, right, is that if you were to actually put your address, your mailing address into your tweet, then it would find it. But there are, it's a lot more, more complicated rules than that.
So basically, you're not using any, let's say, additional, algorithms to actually determine, Twitter handle, or let's say, Foursquare handle, or Facebook handle for the email address. So you're not actually trying to extract any information based on the email address.
As far as I know, I'm pretty sure this is true. I don't work on the matching part of the algorithm, but I'm pretty sure that we don't take anything from the customer information and try to expand it to then hit the social data. I think we're just taking whatever the customer is giving us and primarily just looking at the social data.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So shall I move on to engagements? I say yes. Okay. So engagement. So the thing I wanted to stress about this section is that a lot of this is more exploratory. These are studies. So there are definitely not big data systems behind this yet. This is more trying to understand, how will people react to being engaged with. So that's a little bit more of what we're talking about here. And I think we already talked about why you might want to engage, so I'm going to skip this and talk a little bit more just about what we've been doing. So one of the things that and again, this is changing directions a little bit. So one of the things we've been looking at is a problem that I call, or I like to describe as an information iceberg. So the idea here is that, while there is obviously a lot of stuff going on out in social media, people are talking about a lot of different things, they're still not talking about everything. So you can kind of imagine, you think about an iceberg floating out there in the water, the little tiny bit of the iceberg that's above the surface, that's kind of like the information that's revealed through status updates. There is a lot more useful information that people know that they're not revealing, and some of it, we wouldn't expect them to reveal, sensitive information and whatnot. But there also are other things where, they just ran out of 140 characters to write it. They didn't think it would be interesting. But these pieces of information might be things that, as a company, for example, we might want to gain access to. And so we might want to reach out to these people to attempt to get at that information. And so that's exactly, that leads right into this slide, right? So how do we get at that information that's below the surface of the water? And one way to do that is that we could, just reach out to these people and ask them questions, right? And so there are a few advantages to this approach. There are also disadvantages, obviously, but there are a few advantages. One is that the information that that we get back, I would argue that information is easier to extract from the responses that we get from people because we know what question we ask them, and as a result of that, we're going to get a certain type of response back that's really different from kind of traditional social media listening, where the information could be phrased in any number of different ways. It can be very difficult to parse out. We also get an advantage with the sample range. So because we know, because we're asking the questions, we can target those questions to a specific set of people. For example, if we had a political question, we could target some of those to Democrats, some of those to Republicans. We would know, what our sample range is and a little bit about those people. You also, in the case of social media listening, if you want to find out some particular piece of information, you've got to wait for people to decide to talk about it. Whereas if you're asking the questions, you can just get those questions out there and hopefully start getting some responses back quickly. So you're not limited to just waiting for people to talk about what interests you. And finally, another thing I think that's interesting, although we haven't explored this last one in as much depth, if you know a person's going to go into a situation where they might get some information that's of interest to you, you could prime them with the question before they actually end up in that situation, so that when they actually are there, then they will remember the answer and might get back to you. So there are a bunch of questions I'm sure that you're having as well about how feasible is this approach? Especially we're talking about this on Twitter, right? Essentially what's happening is I'm just typing away on my Twitter and suddenly I get a random question from someone else, right? So are people going to answer those kinds of questions that come from a stranger, that comes from someone they don't know? Is there anything that we can do to incentivize people to respond more? What can we do in that space? And finally, are we getting good answers back from people? So these are a few different questions that we were interested in answering, and so what we did is we have done a couple studies on Twitter where we went out and literally asked a bunch of people, and collected some results. So there are two prototypes I'm going to talk about today. One is this one called the TSA Tracker. So this is something we did a couple years ago, I guess, where essentially what we're trying to do is crowdsource airport security wait times through Twitter. So what we're doing is we are watching for people to tweet about being in an airport, and in this specific case, we actually just looked for people who were tweeting that they were at an airport through Foursquare, because those were easy to parse. We knew for sure they were at an airport. We would then ask them nicely if they would be willing to share their wait time with other people, and if they responded back, that's great. We would collect that. We threw it up on a website, tsatracker.org. It should still be there and running. And we thanked and sent them a link to the website. So with this prototype, primarily what we were looking at was, will people respond to questions from strangers? But we were also trying to understand something about incentives. So we actually asked the question in two different ways. Actually, what we really did is just added a sentence onto the end of the question. So at the top, sent from the account TSA Tracker. By the way, these Twitter accounts are also still there, so you can go check them out if you want. So from TSA Tracker, we sent the, if you went through security at airport code, can you reply with your wait time? Info will be used to help other travelers. And so that last sentence there, that's the motivating statement, is that just basically to tell people that, hey, this information is going to be used to help other people, so maybe that's something you'll be able to utilize yourself in the future, etc. And then from the TSA tracking account, we just did not include that sentence. So we just asked people for their wait time, and that was it. So that was the TSA Tracker prototype. We also did a prototype around product reviews. So the idea here is that we're looking for people who own a product. And I want to emphasize we did not do this automatically. We had people looking at strings of tweets and just picking out the people. Although this probably could be automated. We just didn't do it for this experiment. So in this case, here's one example. Steel Toad says, I dropped my Canon 7D last week. So now we know that he owns a Canon 7D. So from that, what we did in the second step is we had come up with a set of questions about the product. So we actually, I guess it's not on the slide, we actually did this in 3 different product categories. We did this for digital cameras, obviously. We also did it for the Galaxy Tab 10.1, obviously a somewhat old tablet now, but it was the hot tablet of the week when we did this. And we also did Los Angeles area food trucks, actually. And so for each of those types, what we did was we came up with a set of focus questions about that type of product. And the idea here was that, if we had answers to all of these questions, then that would be a good product review. So the idea here is we're trying to crowdsource a product review. We're going to ask a bunch of different people, one of these questions. In the end, we're going to have a bunch of answers to all of these questions, and that might be a good product review. We did product reviews for a couple different reasons. One, we want to do product reviews in part because there are other sources of this information, so we can look a little bit about what's the quality of the information we get back as compared to other sources like reviews on Amazon.com or Yelp in this case. We also thought though that there might be, and this turned out not to be true at least in this initial iteration, but it's possible that maybe it could be done better. We thought that there might be something interesting about product reviews collected in this way. They're not, unlike reviews on those other sites, they're not, people aren't just going to these sites and writing the reviews, right? Those people have some intrinsic motivation to do that. In this case, we're reaching out to people who probably would not be writing those reviews otherwise and trying to collect information from them. We thought there might be something interesting there, a new way to do product reviews.
So
didn't turn out to work. But
so
yeah.
right now, did you gather any data from Yelp.com? Yelp.
Yeah, we did get a little bit of data from Yelp. We looked, it might be in here later, but I think about 50 reviews for each of the 3 food trucks that we ended up looking at. Very manual collection. It was not, nothing particularly special about what we did there. So the other thing we did here as well, in addition to, we had these different kinds of questions and stuff, we also asked follow-up questions. So if you answered our first question, we would then respond back and ask you a second question. And it varied based on the product we were asking about. In some cases, we asked up to 3 or 4 follow-up questions. In other cases, we only asked 1. So the key questions for this prototype were, will people respond to questions in this different domain? Are there any difference in the response rates? And do the responses contain, useful and accurate information? Is it a good, relatively good quality product? So I think I emphasized this enough already, but a lot of this was a human-based process. This is the dashboard we built to do it. You definitely, again, I think could automate this, but again, we were just trying to do a study to explore it. It wasn't worth automating yet at the time. And so here are the results. First of all, an interesting result was that our TSA tracking account, and this is the only account of all the different accounts we use, which was the no incentive condition in the TSA tracker one. It got a 1-week suspension from Twitter after it asked 150 questions. I should point out also that it doesn't, what we're doing here doesn't violate the Twitter terms of use. And it wasn't, we didn't get a lot of information out of Twitter as to why it was blocked, but what we do know is that it was an automated block. It wasn't like someone was explicitly looking at our account and decided that it should be blocked. It's just that people who are receiving the messages from this account, mark this messages as spam or block the user enough times that it caused the account to get suspended. But again, I want to point out that none of our other accounts have this problem, and our other accounts, as you'll see in a second, ask many, many, many more questions than this one. So I think this is an interesting result, which I'll describe in a second. So these are the results from the TSA tracker study. Also a little bit of results from the product reviews with cameras. So again, on this slide, what we're looking at is the key question of will people respond to questions from strangers? So I would argue that yes, they do, because we get a 42% response rate pretty evenly across all of these conditions. We also get our answers back in a fairly reasonable period of time. Almost half the answers are back in 30 minutes, which is pretty good, I think. One of the most interesting things is that there's no significant difference in response rate across the conditions. So that means there's not even a difference in response rate between the account that got suspended and the account that wasn't, which I think is really interesting. And you will notice, of course, that the number here is a little bit lower, but that's actually because the account got suspended. So at the point it got suspended, people didn't see its questions anymore. So there was a little bit of there was not quite as much of a long tail. And actually, I should point out that before I go any further, there is quite a long tail here. While it's true that we get half of our answers in 30 minutes, we do get some of our answers much longer after that. I believe the longest response, we got an answer about 2 weeks later. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe they were back at the airport and were answering the question again, or I'm not sure. But anyway, there is definitely a long tail here. The point I was making, though, about the significance difference between conditions. So what I think is particularly interesting there is, apparently, my interpretation is this. Apparently, there are people who will respond and people who won't. That seems to be the case. And the incentive that we're giving people, that incentive doesn't affect the people who will respond. They will just always respond. You don't have to give them an incentive. We get the same response rate. What seems to be interesting, though, is the incentive actually seems to affect the people that won't respond. So you give them an incentive, they still won't respond. However, what they will do, apparently, is if you give them an incentive, they'll say, okay, I understand why you sent me that question, and I won't mark it as spam. Whereas if you don't give me that incentive, then I'm just going to go, smack you in the face.
So,
yeah.
I guess you can't really tell this, but do you think there's any correlation between the people who respond to messages or questions from strangers to those who click on email from random people?
Are the people more susceptible to phishing attacks? Yeah. I don't know. There are, though, what I will say, and I don't think I have slides about this in this deck, but I'll bring something up when I get to the end here. What we have done, though, is we've taken the personality modeling that we did previously, and we have been able to identify, we're better able to identify the people who will respond using those personality types. So we can actually get our response rates up into the 60% range by trying to target just the people we think are going to respond.
So how many categories of your personality, of a typical individual's personality profile? How many categories?
There are a few. So there are the five main personality types, the ocean categories of openness, agreeableness, etc. There are actually 6, I think, subfacets of each one. So that's 35, right? So that's 35 potential features.
So what is your criteria in specifying the number of categories? Because you can increase it or you can decrease it.
I guess I'm confused. I mean, those categories, the 5 personality types and the 6 subfacets, that's something that psychologists have come up with. I mean, it's not like we didn't invent that. So, but I mean, we do. This is getting a little off track for this part of the talk, but we do. I mean, we did obviously do some feature selection on those features. We also had some other behavioral features and other things. So not all of the personality features, came into play. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So, these questions you asked, there was a certain amount of self-interest involved in giving a response.
Sure.
Same like the Waze model. If you report cops and someone else can report cops, I benefit. But that doesn't directly map to, if you were asking someone when they wanted to buy their next car. I mean, I would see that pretty much in all circumstances as, spam.
Yep.
So how are you going to use this beyond this particular model?
Well, that's a great question. And honestly, I would have to say that we're still looking into that, but I do think the one idea we have that may or may not be good because we haven't tested it yet is basically to start an engagement that we hope to end in a purchase, but start it with just kind of questions of this form. So if we see someone that says, I'm thinking about buying a laptop, maybe we could ask them a question like, what do you... These are not well thought out scenarios, I just want to be clear on that. But, we might ask them a question like, how big do you want that laptop to be? Or something like that, right? To kind of try to join them in the buying process, have a conversation about it, and then if we have an offer at the end that makes sense based on what we learn about them, then we can offer that, and if we don't, then we don't. That's one idea. There may certainly be others.
or you just rely on practitioners in a specific vertical to apply this
Sure.
as appropriate to their customer base.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. You can also imagine a service where people sign up to, you know, be asked questions about what they want to buy or to receive offers or something. That certainly would be another possibility.
So what kind of data model you are using? For example, SQL, NoSQL, NewSQL, to make your system more scalable?
Well, honestly, right now, I mean, there's what, like maybe 100 attributes per person. So, I mean, we're just using a relational database. We don't have a lot of scalability
Do
issues.
you have any sort of benchmark data, for example, to predict how accurate, a particular individual's personality? For example, yourself.
We do. I talked about that a little bit earlier. Where, I mean, we've certainly done analyses for the people we have ground truth with. You may remember that I mentioned, you know, if we have about 200 tweets, that gets us to a pretty reasonable spot. 400 gets us really solid. We don't have a benchmark based on that. And in fact, I can think of a bunch of things we probably want to add to that benchmark, like variation in the word use across the different categories and stuff like that, but we haven't been doing anything like that yet. That's a really good idea, actually. Yeah.
What do you think is the commercial potential of this technology, right? I mean, have you had a lot of your clients, get excited when you talk to them and they're willing to spend a ton of money on this kind of stuff, or it's a school and good to know?
We've been getting a lot of positive reaction to this. I think that said, and obviously we've got some customers to sign up and do pilots with us, which are going on right now, in fact. More on the personality side of it as opposed to this specific like engaging in Twitter part. But there has been a lot of excitement. I think the biggest question that still remains is exactly how to use it. I can certainly give you a bunch of possible ideas. And I think we were talking about some of them earlier, right? I mean, if you have the transaction history and personalities, and in fact it was in the video too, right? You know, we saw high openness and married people seem to be an interesting category to look at versus single people with, or was it married people with low openness and single people with high openness? Right, and so one of the things we've been looking at is like, can we customize messages based on personality? Seems that we can, but we still have to do tests to understand better, how well that works. So I guess the answer is there's a lot of interest right now, but
yeah, the reason I asked this question is, and there's a lot of analytics people in the audience today, right?
Sure.
Whatever I'm hearing from professional engagements is that analytics companies are struggling to productize, right? All analytics projects are ending up as professional services kind of projects, and they're learning that one size really doesn't fit all. So so that's why the question of commercial potential comes into the picture. That
right.
There's a lot of money being invested in R&D of big data analytics.
Sure.
But then is anyone really making money out of it? Right?
Well, we're in research, so we're not making money. But would we like to make money? Yes. Will we make money? I think so. I feel like, at least in this marketing instance, I mean, we have a product, IBM has a product, which we purchased a couple years ago called Unica, which does a lot of marketing automation. And I think we have a pretty clear picture of how this could integrate into integrate to that product and probably scale out to a bunch of different companies.
What is that called again?
Unica?
Unica.
It was called Unica. I think now it's called
Endeca.
Enterprise Marketing Management, perhaps, EMM. We're IBM, so we had to take a nice short name and make it really long.
That's the Oracle model.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned incentives. Do you have data showing how the response rate changed after you used incentives?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I would kind of say that the data we're looking at right here does that, but we didn't. I mean, the one thing in your question that we did not do is we kind of simultaneously asked questions with the incentive and without. So it's not like we were asking it with the incentive at some point and turned it on. But when using an incentive and when not using the incentive, we saw the same response rates. It's just that the one count got suspended.
Oh, it was the same response rate.
Yes, same response
But,
rate. Yeah, no problem.
but this was sort of a benevolent incentive. If you said something like, you'll get a Starbucks after you get out of the queue, you probably might get
better.
higher response.
Yep.
Right?
I'm actually really curious. We haven't done that. I'm really curious about that because I wonder how many people would believe us, and I wonder if they didn't believe us. Like, I mean, how do I prove to you in a tweet that I will actually give you a Starbucks card?
And then what would
That's
be the
another
quality
side
of
problem.
response?
So then you have to state that you are IBM, from IBM.
That's true. Yeah, if I did it from a very reputable account, then that would probably work.
IBM, then.
Yeah, but they also don't let us researchers get access to the. Anyway, let me jam through some of the rest of these results. I think we're probably going very long here, but so
You have enough time.
I have enough time. All right. So follow-up questions. This probably isn't too surprising, but if you respond to our first question, you're more likely to respond to a follow-up, continuing on up to 3 questions. Obviously, we only asked up to 3 questions. I'm sure that if you ask n questions where maybe it's like 7 to 10, I'm sure that the response rate would fall off, but we don't know where that happens.
Sure.
So this is information about the quality of the responses. This comes just from our product review results. And so this is all, these are all human-coded results. So this what that means is, we had people just sit down, look at all the responses, and come up with their judgments. 3 people did that. We had pretty good iterator reliability. One of the main things to take out of this is that we do get fairly high amounts of relevant answers. So the tablet case, 70% of the answers were relevant. The food truck case, 88% of them were. It actually turned out in the tablet case, I don't know why this wasn't apparent to us a priori, but as you all know now, especially, Samsung has many, many products in its Galaxy product line, since we were asking questions about those. Back when we did this, there were fewer, but we would still get people who had phones or the older version of the tablet that had come up before the one we asked about. So we had some problems there, and I think that's why quality lags somewhat here. And so we also broke out the irrelevant responses, and so you can see, in the tablet case, the reason we got a lot of irrelevant responses was because people didn't have any experience with the product. We asked about the phone. We asked someone who had the phone or something like that. So that really just stresses the fact that, obviously targeting is really important. And surprisingly, only a few people thought we were a bot. And these were all actually human-asked questions, I should point out. But that didn't come up very much. So targeting is a big deal. I think as you increase targeting, you should increase the quality of your responses. So that was, I thought, a positive result. Some qualitative results. At least with the TSA tracker stuff, we got some followers. A lot of people told us this would be great for travelers. One person did give us a slightly negative response. They told us this is creepy, but they also answered our questions. So I guess it wasn't that creepy. I don't know.
This is creepy, but I like it.
Yeah, they're that kind of person. We should have made use of that.
Totally interesting.
Okay, so I do have a little bit, I mentioned this before, I guess I do have some slides about it. So one of the big questions, how can we then use the intrinsic traits to improve our engagement? I mean, in particular, can we distinguish between the people who will respond and will not? So yes, we can do that. And so what we started out with here, we had our data sets from this engagement. We ran our personality inference on them. And so we came up with a bunch of features. So there were obviously the personality features that I've already talked about, but we also looked at a bunch of other features. The percentage of tweets occurring each hour of the day, number of tweets, use of particular word control. I mean, you can read all these, but and actually, I should say, much of what I've been talking about has been described in various academic papers that we published at conferences. So if you want, a lot of in-depth detail on any of this, the papers are out there. I can give you guys links, or you can go to my webpage, which I think I'll have a link to here at some point, to get even more data. Yeah.
Do you have any particular comments on the readiness, like the percentage of tweets? Are there like particular peak times, window times within the day, and non-peak, pretty much like in traffic engineering?
Yes, there are. It's possible that I might have a slide. I can find a slide about that somewhere, but it doesn't look like I have one in here. But It's an interesting. It's actually kind of an interesting curve. It peaks, as I recall, it peaks in the morning, and then decreases during the workday. It peaks again at lunch, and then kind of ramps up around dinner time. Yeah, it's actually a very. It's interesting. So now I'm going to go off on a tangent. I apologize. So it's actually a very it's a fairly well-defined curve, and it definitely moves by time zone. And so, in fact, I mentioned that we did some work on location inference before. So, in fact, a big part of what we did in location inference was to utilize prediction of time zone. So we can actually really, really reliably predict what time zone you're in based on your tweeting behavior. It works quite well, actually. Yeah.
So at the beginning, you talked about marketing individuals at scale, but you also described this as small enough to be on a relational database. Have you done anything with much larger data sets, or do you have any projections what much larger data sets, as in petabytes, or terabytes, I mean, terabytes of data might do to this model?
I don't think that. Well, actually, wait. So you mean this model here, this specific model, or just in
your
general?
approach?
The personality approach. No.
You had said at scale at the beginning.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, at scale is more of the story, and is not quite where we are yet. But if we were to scale to terabytes or more data, I don't see any big problems there. Because ultimately, I mean, a lot of this is process once and get these counts out, which we can then use a lot of the time. So, and then updating the counts is very easy because obviously you just add some more numbers on there. So, so scaling-wise, I don't see any major issues coming up, at least with the personality calculation part of it. As we then graduate from there to things here where we're doing kind of more traditional machine learning. I mean, obviously there are going to be probably issues that might come up there, but I guess I guess I'm not sure that that's even going to be true though, because I mean, yeah, training these models can be intensive, but once the model is trained, utilizing the model is typically not that difficult. Because like for example, the personality case, we just have correlation factors which we then use with some simple math to get out what we want. So it's not the processing requirements are not substantial. Okay, so I'll just move on to this. So we had a bunch of features, like I mentioned, and so we did some feature analysis on this. You can kind of pick out here what were the. So we used 3 different data sets. You can see that different features come up for all 3 of the data sets in terms of trying to identify the people who are most likely to respond. But coming out of that were kind of these 4 features on the other side. So communication, that's I believe a subfacet of openness. It was a personality feature that was very highly discriminative, but also there are a bunch of behavior features that are also quite discriminative, past response rate, etc. So this is from the feature analysis. So then when we apply, so we then did we did a few analyses. They're not all here, but the one that we did do was this live experiment where we basically we used Twitter's search API, and so this is kind of a slightly different version of what we did in the TSA tracker case, where we found 1,000 people who had, 500 people who had been in an airport, 500 people in the product cases, and we randomly asked a subset of them. We just randomly picked 100 people out of the set and asked them the question, and then we used our algorithm to identify the top 100 users, and we asked them. And as you can see, we get much better response rates when we apply our algorithm versus when we don't. The random selection response rates are somewhat lower because the method we used for finding the users wasn't quite as accurate, but the targeting wasn't quite as good. But still, we get much better response rates using this.
Can I ask you
yes.
a quick question?
Sure.
Actually, from computer science point of view,
yep.
Which approach you prefer more? I mean, in terms of pure algorithm approach versus big data approach.
When
I mention algorithm approach, I don't have too much data.
But I already, design my algorithm in advance, so I to tackle my problem.
Right.
Versus the other approach, the other approach is I have lots of data, but I don't have serious algorithm, but
Right.
I still can get my solution. Or I derive my insight.
Yeah. So personally, I mean, if I can get away with the algorithm approach, I would much prefer that because I understand. I mean, all the reasoning for how that works, I can very carefully analyze.
It's like a causality.
Right. I mean, if I'm applying, just a statistical, exploratory approach, I mean, that can work very well. It doesn't work very well a lot of the time. But the one thing I always worry about there is I think the assumptions of the people or the person or people who are doing the analysis can sometimes get in there in some ways, and there may be. Well, I certainly believe the results at a high level. I might not believe all the low level things. I think it's really important to be able to explain what the result is at least.
It's about causality versus the correlation.
Right.
Really
Yes, that's
one
certainly part of it. Right.
So you mentioned though that you were using people that had Foursquare accounts. Is
I'm
that
not
for
sure if
the
that's
total-
I'm not sure if that's true at this particular slide, but yes, previously yes.
Okay. So this is just for Twitter accounts.
Well, so what I said before, which may or may not have been true here, because I didn't do this, so I'm not absolutely certain. But what we did before is we were looking at tweets that came from the Foursquare client. So we weren't listening to the Foursquare API directly. We were listening to Twitter, but people do tweet their Foursquare check-ins, and they have a very specific format that's easy to identify. And also, we were able to take the Foursquare check-in link and explicitly verify that it was an airport, because Foursquare has that kind of extra data in their check-in. So that way, in that case, we could be really certain that that person was in an airport. Now, what I'm not sure about, because my colleague did this, and I think he might have done it slightly differently. I think he did some other kind of query to get out whether people were in an airport. It may not have been specific to Foursquare in this specific case. That's probably why the response rates are low.
Oh, that's all.
I'm guessing. Again, I don't know specifically.
I have another question.
Sure.
About the difference, because I think when you said you took the discriminating feature,
yes,
I noticed only one of them was related to personality. Is that correct?
Of the top four.
Of the top four. So did you do any experiment where you took out the personality or put it in and see if there's a difference in response rate? Or how do we know it's because of personality and not the other? We know, but
No,
how
I
much is the
get
difference?
your question.
Yeah.
I think I'd have to refer you to the paper for that. I think that we did. This is a paper we published at a conference called Intelligent User Interfaces back in March. I can give you the link. It's on my webpage too. So I really want to say that we did do that. Maybe not for the live experiment, but we did a bunch of also offline experiments as well. So certainly, I think we can tell you what the impact of different feature types is. So I think that's pretty much the end of the talk. I probably have some conclusion slide here. Psycholinguistics are good. One of the things we're looking at is trying to build a system. As I told you before, we're trying to move away from manual engagement more into this assisted and automatic engagement. We are certainly not there yet, but still, even today, it seems like most of the systems are pretty entirely manual in terms of what's possible with engagement. We're trying to move over here, and I think the one key point is, even if we're not maybe quite doing the psycholinguistics on large scales yet, the way the psycholinguistic analysis is set up does allow it to scale very well. There are a lot of use cases that we can apply. Some of our engagement techniques, at least, seem to be feasible and provide quality information. And this last bullet, obviously written for people we're trying to sell to. If you wanted to use this system in a pilot, certainly something we can talk about. So I'm happy to talk about anything else for as long as you want.
And quick question. So,
yeah.
So what's the working definition of engagement here?
That's a great question. I guess the working definition of engagement for me is any time where we reach out to an individual to learn something or try to get them to do something, or guess I'm thinking more about social media engagement, so I'm thinking about, you know, sending them a message or otherwise contacting them. I mean,
okay, so response to messages is engagement.
yeah, I guess.
I think engagement is the process try to turning prospects into customers before he make a purchase decision.
That's certainly one definition.
Like before manager, that's called engagement. What's the difference?
That is engagement in marketing.
What's the difference?
I think our definition is maybe a little bit looser than that in terms of just communicating, not.
That's what I was.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned there was you did micro segments and you looked at, like, for example, a bank might want to look at what personality types are open to flexible adjust rate mortgages or long-term mortgages based on their personality types.
Yep.
So this new psychometric score will then go with their maybe credit score to sort of size them up as to how good of a customer will they be, or what type of financial product they might want in the future.
Yep.
And, you know, on one side, this reduces, of course, their marketing budget because they know, who to talk to, but also it reduces the consumer's transaction costs, right?
Yes.
Which are, I mean, I find that they're huge when you go researching mortgages and who's going to really work best for me as a bank. And I think that's really important to consider on the other end is that, if you understand what kind of psychometric data you want to release to the big, blogosphere, tweetosphere, or whatever you want to call it, you can actually try and gauge, how you want to be characterized.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting things there. To those points, one of the things we've been thinking about, which is a little bit different than anything I talked about today, but it's kind of offering like a service maybe where you could go and explicitly, kind of request your personality or whatever. And maybe you could see like people like me like this or something. I mean, there might be something in that space. We're actually kind of thinking about that as a healthcare application. And that's a very early idea, but yeah, and I think the other idea, of course, of maybe creating a service where people go and do the personality score, the actual personality surveys, which, I mean, I feel we get fairly good results out of what is shown here, but the personality surveys are always going to be better. They're well-designed surveys that do a good job of extracting that information, do it very reliably. If we can get people to do the surveys instead, and maybe choose to release it here versus there, I think there's a lot of potential for data markets of that kind. It would be nice to see the consumer get a hold of those data markets instead of the credit bureaus and all those other people. I don't know if anyone's here from that.